Thank you very much, and morning everybody. Welcome to this morning's webinar on knowing the unknown in terms of ransomware attacks. Now, to start off the presentation, the first thing we need to be aware of is what actually is malware. What is it? Now, malware is generally just software specifically written to be malicious. The reasoning for that code to be written doesn't really matter. It depends on the attacker, but that's what malware is. It comes in a number of different guises. Malware is a generic term because it covers a range of different malicious code. The main guises of malware are viruses. Now, a virus is generally aimed to infect existing software which is already on a device. And a virus traditionally requires a user action to spread. So whether that user action to be, for example, opening an attachment in an email, whether it's doing something within an application, it's something that the user has to do to allow that piece of code to actually spread to other machines, which is slightly different to a worm. A worm traditionally also infects existing software which is already on a machine. But what it will aim to do is spread across the network to different devices across the network without any user action. So it will infect the local machine and then it will automatically try and go out and infect other machines across the network, anything else it's got access to. The third guise of a piece of malware is a Trojan horse. Now, a Trojan horse can be one of the more difficult pieces of malware to identify because it does impersonate some legitimate software. Traditionally, what they will do is try and infect an operating system and pretend to be a legitimate service on that operating system. And then what they'll do is they'll use the fact that they're actually running on the operating system and the user doesn't know because they believe it's legitimate software to then carry out whatever malicious activity the attacker's actually given that piece of software. Now, that activity could be absolutely anything from infecting on the machines, getting your username and password, or potentially anything up to spreading about the network, or even just getting information about the individual user. Rootkits are applications which are written and designed to be undetected because they actually work out to be a springboard for other malware. So once a rootkit has got onto your machine, what it will actually do is sit there and traditionally do very little for a period of time. Now, that period of time can be anything from 5–10 minutes to potentially months. And what it will do is it will wait for a particular condition to occur and wait for something else to leverage its ability that it's already on a machine. The last form of malware is spyware. And spyware is something which on a machine, it will literally just sit there and monitor. All it will do is look for something that happens on the machine, and it will grab information which can be saleable generally. Now, that could be your username and password. It could be potentially your credit card information, which you've stored on your browser. It could be a username and password for eBay. It could be a username and password for anything. But spyware is traditionally sat on your machine for the sole purpose of getting information which can then be sold. Now, why does ransomware exist? Ransomware has been around since the existence of computers. Once software was written for computers, developers generally then used their ability to be able to alter the way that the machine worked to prank each other. That was the original form of ransomware and malware. What would have happened was a developer back in the 90s would have wrote a little bit of code and it would have probably just popped a message up, for example, on someone's machine, and that message could have been hello or got you or whatever the prank was aimed at. Unfortunately, since then, that's kind of escalated. And then from the mid to late 80s, that's now a commercialized industry. And unfortunately, it is one of the most thriving industries in the computer world. A significant amount of money actually exists and is actually generated by the use of ransomware and malware. It's generated now because it's an easy source of income. People will pay money to have their files decrypted, or they will pay the money to believe that their files can be decrypted. It's generated for disruption. Generally, industrial espionage can be quite easily a main source of malware. it doesn't have to be written to target an individual or a business, for example, just for the sole use of making money. It can be to aim at a competitor to bring potential systems down in the scenario where power plants are aimed at, and industry, that type of industry can be the target of any type of disruptive form of malware. And then a targeted attack. So somebody aim an attack at a particular person. Now, this doesn't necessarily be industry standard, but it's aimed at an individual or an organization for the sole purpose of taking that industry or that person or the individual out, as in to stop their services. Now, if we look at a recent report which was created by Malwarebytes towards the end of 2016, they currently estimate that over 66% of the malware which is currently in circulation at the minute, which is actively going around the internet and can be identified, is used for ransomware. That just proves how much of an industry that the whole malware generation actually is. Because if 66% of ransomware, malware is ransomware, then that shows that there's actually a massive amount of people that will actually be willing to pay for the promise of getting their data back. Because if people weren't paying that money to actually get their data decrypted by the person who encrypted it in the first place, then people wouldn't create it anymore. It'd be a dead industry. And unfortunately, that does happen. To give a bit of a case study of how malware can actually infect a machine or infect a network, traditionally, an attacker somewhere on the internet will actually create, for example, a malware attack. They'll potentially embed that into an email and then send that email out to an individual. Now, remember, this is generally done on a global scale, so it won't be a single individual this email is sent to, but at some point, it may potentially end up in your inbox, at which point you see the email. You then open the email, and it contains a PDF document. Now, that PDF document could be anything from potentially a sales invoice or anything which you as an individual were expecting or could be expected or could want to expect as part of your day-to-day job. Now, within that PDF document, there could be a link back to the attacker without you even knowing. All that do, you open the PDF document, and as soon as it opens, there's a little bit of code embedded in that PDF document which sends a response call back to the attacker and gives the attacker actually a remote shell to your machine. Now, simply a remote shell is just a command or a way of then gaining access to your machine without you knowing. Unfortunately, as soon as the attacker's got to that point, they can then send any information that they want to or any commands that they want to the machine which has been infected. Now, that's generally a command and control scenario where an attacker is actually required to actually be sat at a machine to do something on your machine. Whether that do something, it could be, for example, encrypt your machine, it could be steal some passwords, it could be potentially go and infect another machine. Quite often that potentially isn't the case, and it may well be that the exploit is self-contained within the PDF document. So it doesn't require the connection back to the attacker, but it still exists on the machine and the code is still executed on the machine, normally without you even knowing. Now to move one step further to where we were, say, 2 months ago, when WannaCry hit, a lot of people got hit with WannaCry because they didn't understand the way that it got in and how it worked. Now, WannaCry was a really simple exploit. Literally all that happened is there was a connection into a server. Where that server is, it doesn't really matter, but there must have been a connection to a server somewhere in a network over port 445, which is SMB, which is the protocol that was used to infect the machines. Now, once the attacker got actually access to that machine, they didn't have to do any callback to the attacker. What actually happened is the attacker then got a shell direct onto that machine. And if there's anybody technical in the audience at the minute, in essence, they were just authenticated as the network user. Now, from that point, you're already infected inside your organization. And at that point, all the other machines which were behind the firewall in your organization, in your network somewhere, that piece of malware then tried to spread itself. What it done is it went to all of the other machines, whether it be servers, whether it be clients, but as long as that protocol existed and was open, and it was vulnerable to a particular type of attack, so it wasn't patched recently, that machine could then easily be infected via the first infected machine. And again, we get the connection to that machine, allowing us to run anything we want to, And unfortunately, what happened then at that point was all of those machines were then encrypted. At that point, everything in the network's encrypted. It's not just a couple of machines. It could potentially be a significant number of machines, as what happened in some of the NHSs in the UK. And then as soon as that machine has been encrypted, it would reboot, and you would get the unfortunate ransomware traditional message, which is, I've encrypted all your files, please send me some money to decrypt your files. And unfortunately, that would never ever work because the mailbox which was being used didn't work. It was written purely as a malicious piece of code which had no ability to give you your data back. So now we've covered ransomware, what it is and how it infects our machine. What we need to do is, based on our knowledge of how it works, how do we actually stop ransomware? And the simple matter of fact is we need to go back to basics of network security. Software patching, not just Microsoft patches either. It's fine patching an operating system that's all patched and up to date, happy days, but the problem is we require other applications. A machine which has only got Windows and Office on is all well and good, but it's very limiting to our job. We need other pieces of software on our machines. But because we have other pieces of software on the machine, we do also need to ensure that those are patched up to date, whether it be third-party browsers, so it's Firefox, it's Chrome, it's Safari, anything else, whether we've got Java to run internal applications. All of these tools always need to be updated. Antivirus solution. Now, it doesn't matter what that antivirus solution is. It doesn't even matter if it's on the client. It could be something that's looking at your network. It could be on your firewall. It could be in your mail and your web filters. But all of those antivirus pieces of software need to have up-to-date sets of definitions. Otherwise, you'll never be testing for new vulnerabilities, for new exploit kits. All you'll actually be doing is testing for whenever the definition update was last carried out. Sensible network security controls, making sure that you have a firewall with no blatant any rules, ensuring that local administrators, system administrators, or network administrators use correct security controls. They're not using one account, which is a shared account between everybody with a simple password. Security controls, and also auditing. If something does happen, we need the ability to audit the devices and audit network devices to make sure we can see what's happened, and not just what's happened, but who's actually done that. We need full accounting purposes for everything. And the last thing is staff training and awareness. Unfortunately, the weakest point of most networks is the thing that's sat between the chair and the computer, which is the human. Human error is the biggest cause of malware infections, simply because humans are generally not trained. Now, allowing staff to be aware of malware, how it infects networks and what to look for can be a critical part of ensuring that you don't get infected at some point in the future. Because the more that staff know, everybody from, for example, your receptionists all the way through to your network administrators need to know infection points, how they come in, how they work. They don't need to know from a technical perspective, but as long as they know the generic process, they know what to look for. They know how to identify a particularly malicious email. Visibility. Visibility is a massive part of understanding how you can potentially be infected, and also then stopping your potential infection paths in the first place. Do you know your current network state? What's on your network? Relatively simple question. What devices do you have on your network? Are they phones? Are they iPhones? Are they Windows servers? Are they clients? What type of clients are they? Do you know what's actually connected to your network? Analysis. This is a really difficult one. What are the devices on your network actually doing? Because if you have a lot of, for example, myself as a traveling consultant, my laptop device, is sometimes in Sapphire's network and sometimes not. When I'm out, there's not necessarily the visibility there is when I'm in the network. So when I come back into the network, that's where the analysis needs to come in. No, it's been in an untrusted network. What's the machine actually doing? Is there anything wrong with it? Is it behaving differently to the way that it traditionally will? Implementing a vulnerability management program. Can you see how your devices are changing? Is again a critical way of identifying where your weak points are. If a device, for example, is constantly sat at a particular security level, be that security level being really weak because it's got old versions of Java and old browsers and there hasn't been any Windows patching doing, or it could be a really strong position. But a really strong position is relative to a time. So what you've got to understand is that although you may have a fully secured network today, tomorrow it won't be, because all of the new exploits which have come out or which have been identified during the course of that time, your machines haven't been patched to that point, so it needs to be a constantly evolving program. In addition to the vulnerability management program, we do need an awareness program. We need to inform staff of new forms of malware and intrusion, how they work, how they're getting into the network, and what those individual members of staff need to look for to be able to help you in addition to your security controls, your network security controls, what they need to look for to help you. If you can run a constantly evolving vulnerability management network improvement program, you're well on the way to enabling a far better ability for you to protect yourself against malware and any other form of unwanted software. Now what I'd like to do is just have a little bit of audience participation, just to get a little bit of feedback on if one of the biggest issues facing network administrators, as we've said, is visibility. Remember, there's no such thing as 100% secure. We'll never ever secure absolutely everything. That's something that everybody needs to understand. So coming up shortly will be a number of questions. If all of the attendees could answer the following 3 questions, there's an option for yes, no, or unsure. Unsure basically means you don't know an explicit yes or no. So it could well be that do you have visibility of your network of all devices? It could be that you know you do have some, but you don't have others, or you're just not in a position to know that information based on your job role. So do you have visibility of the status of all devices on your network? Thank you. And can you see what the devices on your network are actually doing? This is very much geared around network analysis. Thank you. The last question is, do you currently have the resources to validate the previous 2 questions? So if something happened, do you have the resources to actually use the answer to the last 2 questions to validate any information that's come from your vulnerability management, your network intrusion systems? Thank you very much for those questions. For anybody that answered yes to all 3 of those questions, then well done to you guys. You're in a very strong position. You already have a good grasp of what's on your network. And not only that, you probably already have the processes in place to actually aid you improve where you currently are. Detection and prevention. To be able to detect and prevent anything, again, you need to know your current network state. Without knowing what's currently in your network, you have no way of prioritizing how to fix something that you don't know about. How do you fix something when you don't know it already exists? A good example of that is if we go back, for example, 10, 15 years ago, if an administrator wanted to buy a new system, then he'd have to spec the system out, he'd have to go to Dell and get a price, he'd have to have it approved by a line manager, put the request through to finance would have to order it, the guy who does the signing in of the documents in your warehouse would know that the servers come in, he'd then take it up to you, and everybody knew that a new system was coming into your network. Now it's very difficult to identify when new systems are brought online. With the introduction of hypervisors, we can't always see that new systems are being spun up by somebody. A testing system is a fairly common scenario. We'll fire up a new virtual machine, we'll do a little bit of work on it, and we'll do some testing, and then that's project over. But unless that virtual machine is completely destroyed, that could be the weak point of your network, and that could be the intrusion point. Analysis. We need to constantly have reanalysis of all of the vulnerabilities on our network. In addition to just the vulnerabilities, we need to analyze the network behavior as well. So what devices are on the network and how are they being used on the network? This constant reanalysis will always ensure that we're using a more up-to-date set of controls and up-to-date set of detection mechanisms based on what's currently being identified within the internet and the network security space. A vulnerability management program. It's fairly simple. It doesn't have to be costly, but it can be timely. A vulnerability program with the adoption of one of these, or at least the constantly evolving vulnerability management program, will help reduce your risk of infection, simply because you are then constantly patching and fixing issues which have been identified within your network. The more issues that you can fix, the lower the actual potential target area that you have within your organization, within your network. And again, an awareness program. Staff training. Constant update of staff training. It doesn't have to be taking staff out of work for days on end. A simple little presentation, for example, a little email, something to give the staff information. But what you do need to do is ensure that your staff are actually digesting the information that's being sent out. So again, constantly evolving program of identifying where you are and where you're going to. So for the implementation of a vulnerability management program, we need to do a few things. We need to discover, so what's on the network? Once we find out what's on the network, we can then prioritize. Without a prioritization, how do you know where you should be starting your patching? Unfortunately, this is something that's missing from the vast majority of vulnerability management programs. Everybody thinks that a critical vulnerability is a critical vulnerability. But if it's in a network which is fairly secure, as opposed to, say, for example, an internet-facing system, your priority should be your internet-facing system, depending on what it is. Prioritization is key. After your prioritization, you then assess what's on those devices. From your assessment phase, you can then report on what the current state is. Without the ability to report before you remediate, you would have no way of knowing of how your network is improving, because you're constantly reporting on fixed assets, which defeats the object of a vulnerability management program. So reporting on where you initially were, you then go and fix, remediate, patch the machines, improve the local security policy, remove some users that are local admins that shouldn't be, for example, that type of thing. And then once you've done that, you verify that the remediation program has gone ahead, that the remediation process has actually been successful. And then once you've verified, you start the process all over again. Because once you've got through the first 6 objects that we've got through there with the vulnerability management program, the network environment will have changed, or at least the threat landscape will have changed, and we have to constantly reevaluate the whole process. Network improvement programs, again, are something slightly different to vulnerability analysis. This involves the actual devices within the network. First, we need to prepare network segments. Which network segments are required for the network, for example. Then we need to set out some goals for the network security program. So do we need to segregate certain areas of the network? Design, draw out your network, get it ratified. There's no point one person being in charge of the whole network improvement program if that person isn't an expert leader. In reality, more people, a different set of reviews and different set of ways of identifying potential design flaws is an easy way to actually reduce the amount of work that you're going to have in the future. The implementation phase is just building that network improvement. So whether that network improvement, for example, be patching your firewall, whatever it is, this is where that comes in. And then the operation phase, which is generally the longest phase of a network improvement program. Monitor the application, monitor the network improvement which is being made. And at this point, this is where you either can truly identify if it's worked, or if it hasn't, identify how you can improve on what you've previously done. So post-operation phase, we can then come up with a way of how do we optimize what we've previously done. And that optimization phase, in essence, leads to the next phase, which is preparing the second phase. And again, it needs to be a constantly evolving process. So just to summarize towards the end of this, malware's here to stay. There's no getting away from it. Threat's real. We've got to adapt as network security teams. We've got to make sure that we know and understand everything. We need to understand our infection entry points. Now, whether that infection point is interfacing servers, whether it's traveling laptops, for example, whether it's mobile phones coming in and joining our Wi-Fi, we need to understand those entry points and also understand how infections can spread. Adopt a software patching regime, critical. Ensure our antivirus and client detection software is up to date. And then ideally, we would implement a vulnerability management and a network improvement plan to go hand in hand with each other. And then lastly, staff training, ensuring all of our staff fully understand what the threats currently in our environment are and how they would identify those threats. And to close, if anybody's interested in learning more about building an effective vulnerability management program, our partner Tenable have produced an ebook, which is 10 Steps to Vulnerability Management. And this outlines the challenges for vulnerability management and crucial weaknesses to look for, including 10 actions you can take to reduce vulnerabilities and how to measure key performance indicators, which is a good way of identifying where you are and where you're going to. This will be made available to everybody after the webinar via an email, and that will contain a link for you to download the document. At that point, I'd just like to open up for any questions, please.